The courtroom was packed. Media cameras lined the back wall. Reporters filled every available seat. And in the front row sat Thomas Fusco, gray-haired now, in his 70s, clutching a photograph of his daughter, Theresa Fusco, forever 16 years old. Frozen in time in a high school photograph, smiling at the camera with her whole life ahead of her. That life ended on November 10th, 1984. She was raped, strangled, and left in a wooded area like garbage. For 41 years, her killer walked free. For 41 years, Thomas Fusco waited for justice. And for 17 of those years, 3 innocent men sat in prison for a crime they didn't commit. But on this October morning in Nassau County Supreme Court, Richard Bilodeau, 63 years old, gray hair, glasses, wearing an orange jumpsuit, stood before Judge Helene Gugerty to hear the charges against him. Richard Bilodeau, you are charged with murder in the second degree, intentional murder. You are further charged with murder in the second degree during the commission of rape. How do you plead? Not guilty, Your Honor. Nassau County District Attorney Ann T. Donnelly stood and addressed the court. Your Honor, the defendant's DNA was recovered from the victim's body in 1984. That DNA sat in evidence for 41 years. In February 2025, investigators recovered a smoothie straw the defendant discarded at a cafe. The DNA from that straw is a 100% match to the DNA from Theresa Fusco's body. Science doesn't lie. After 41 years, 3 wrongful convictions, and decades of pain for Theresa's family, we finally have her killer. Judge Gugerty set bail at remand, meaning Bilodeau would stay in jail awaiting trial. No bail, no freedom. After 41 years of walking free, Richard Bilodeau's days of liberty were over. As he was led out of the courtroom in shackles, Thomas Fusco spoke to reporters gathered outside. His voice shook with emotion. For 41 years, I've wondered who killed my daughter. 3 innocent men went to prison. My family suffered not knowing. But thanks to DNA technology and detectives who never gave up, we finally have answers. Theresa can rest in peace now. But this story doesn't start with justice served in 2025. It starts on a cold November night in 1984, when a 16-year-old girl left work crying after being fired and never made it home. Before we go back 41 years, hit that subscribe button. This case was just solved 7 days ago. The arrest happened October 14th, 2025. This is breaking true crime news. Comment below. Where are you watching from? And let's honor Theresa Fusco's memory by making sure her story is never forgotten. Now let's travel back to November 10th, 1984, to a roller skating rink on Long Island, where a teenage girl was about to work her last shift ever. Theresa Fusco arrived for her shift at Hot Skates roller rink in Lynbrook, New York around 7 p.m. on Saturday, November 10th, 1984. She was 16 years old, a high school student, supplementing her family's income by working the snack bar. It wasn't glamorous work, serving French fries, soda, and candy to kids who came to skate, but it was a job, and Theresa took it seriously. Lynbrook in 1984 was a quiet suburban community on Long Island, about 20 miles from Manhattan. Population around 20,000. The kind of place where parents felt safe letting their teenagers work evening shifts, where violent crime was rare, where everyone knew their neighbors. Hot Skates was a popular hangout for local teens. Disco music, colored lights, the sound of roller skates on hardwood floors. Saturday nights were always busy. Couples on dates, groups of friends, birthday parties. Theresa had worked there for several months. She knew the regulars. She knew which kids always ordered extra cheese on their nachos, which ones tried to sneak free refills. But tonight would be different. Tonight, Theresa's manager would fire her. "You have a bad car." The exact reason Theresa was fired has never been fully disclosed. Some reports suggest it was a minor issue. Maybe she gave away free food to friends. Maybe she was late a few times. Maybe there was a personality conflict with management. In 1984, before employment laws became stricter, teenagers could be fired for minor infractions without much explanation. What we know for certain: around 9:30 p.m., Theresa was told her services were no longer needed. She was devastated. Not just because she lost the job, but because of the humiliation. Fired on a Saturday night, in front of coworkers, in front of customers. 16 years old and suddenly unemployed. Witnesses would later tell police that Theresa left the snack bar crying. She punched out at exactly 9:47 p.m., the time stamped on her time card, which would become crucial evidence. She grabbed her jacket, wiped tears from her face, and walked out of hot skates into the November night. It was cold that evening, temperatures in the low 40s. Theresa wasn't dressed warmly. She wore jeans, a light jacket, sneakers. The roller rink was on Atlantic Avenue in Lynbrook. Her home was about a mile away on Brooklyn Avenue. Normally, she'd call her father Thomas for a ride after late shifts. But she'd just been fired. She was upset, embarrassed. She probably wanted time to process what had happened before telling her parents. She decided to walk home. Multiple witnesses saw Theresa walking along Atlantic Avenue heading toward her neighborhood around 10 p.m. She was alone, still crying, head down, walking quickly. That was the last confirmed sighting of Theresa Fusco alive. Thomas Fusco expected his daughter home by 10:30 p.m. Her shift usually ended around 10 p.m., and the walk home took 20 to 25 minutes. When 10:30 came and went with no Theresa, Thomas wasn't immediately worried. Maybe she'd stopped to talk to friends. Maybe she was walking slowly. But by 11 p.m., worry set in. Thomas called hot skates. The manager told him Theresa had left at 9:47 p.m., over an hour ago. That's when Thomas knew something was wrong. Theresa was responsible. She didn't stay out late without calling. She didn't make her parents worry. Thomas got in his car and drove the route between hot skates and home. He looked for Theresa along Atlantic Avenue, checked side streets, called out her name. Nothing. At 11:30 p.m., he called Lynbrook Police Department to report his daughter missing. The police response was typical for 1984. She probably ran away. Teenagers do that. Give her time to cool down. She'll come home. Missing persons reports for teenagers weren't taken as seriously then as they are today. Police assumed she was upset about being fired and would return when she calmed down. But Thomas Fusco knew his daughter. Theresa wouldn't run away. Something terrible had happened. You can find with us. For nearly a month, Thomas Fusco led search efforts for his daughter. He printed flyers with Theresa's photograph and description. He organized volunteer search parties that combed through Lynbrook and surrounding areas. He gave interviews to local newspapers and TV stations, begging anyone with information to come forward. The case became known locally as part of the Lynbrook Triangle, a reference to the Bermuda Triangle. In the months surrounding Theresa's disappearance, 2 other teenage girls in the Lynbrook area also went missing. The community was terrified. Parents stopped letting their daughters go out alone. The safe suburban bubble of Lynbrook had burst. Police investigated every lead. They interviewed Theresa's friends, classmates, co-workers. They reviewed her diary, looking for any mention of problems or threats. They checked whether she had a secret boyfriend or any conflicts that might explain her disappearance. They found nothing. Theresa was a normal 16-year-old. She had friends but no enemies. She dated casually but had no serious boyfriend. She did well in school. She helped around the house. There was no reason for her to run away, and no one who would want to hurt her. As days turned into weeks, hope faded. Thomas Fusco knew deep down that his daughter was dead. But he kept searching. He needed to find her. He needed answers. Of course. On Wednesday, December 5th, 1984, 25 days after Theresa disappeared, a local resident was walking through a wooded area near Park Place in Lynbrook, not far from Halstead. The area was used as a shortcut between neighborhoods. People walked through it regularly. The resident noticed something partially covered by leaves and old shipping pallets. At first they thought it might be a discarded mannequin or pile of clothing. But as they got closer, the horrible truth became clear. It was a body. A female. Partially decomposed after nearly a month, exposed to November weather. The resident ran to the nearest house and called 911. Lynbrook police arrived within minutes. They secured the scene, cordoned off the area with yellow crime scene tape. The medical examiner was called. Detectives began processing what was clearly a homicide scene. The victim's clothing was disturbed. There were signs of sexual assault. Visible ligature marks on the neck indicated strangulation. The positioning of the body, partially hidden under leaves and pallets, suggested the killer had tried to conceal it but hadn't taken it far from where the attack occurred. By that afternoon, dental records confirmed what everyone feared. The body was Theresa Fusco. For life. The medical examiner's report would later detail the full extent of what Theresa endured. Cause of death? Strangulation by ligature, meaning something was wrapped around her neck and pulled tight, possibly a cord, rope, or piece of clothing. Sexual assault. Clear evidence of rape, with biological material collected for evidence. Timeline. Death occurred approximately 24 to 48 hours after she was last seen, meaning she likely died November 11th to 12th, 1984. Location. Killed at or very near where her body was found. Approximately half a mile from her home and the roller rink. Evidence collected. Vaginal swabs containing the killer's DNA. Ligature material, if any was left on scene. Clothing and personal effects. Soil samples. Photographs documenting the scene. In 1984, DNA analysis was still years away from being used in criminal investigations. The biological evidence was preserved, but investigators had no way to identify a specific individual from it. All they could determine was blood type, information that could narrow suspect pools, but couldn't definitively identify a killer. The medical examiner preserved everything meticulously. Vaginal swabs were labeled, sealed in evidence containers, and stored properly. This careful work in 1984 would ultimately solve the case 41 years later. Detectives working Theresa's case followed standard investigative protocols. They began with people closest to her, expanding outward in circles. Family. Thomas Fusco and immediate family members were quickly cleared. Thomas had an alibi. He'd been home the entire evening of November 10th, had called the roller rink looking for Theresa, had reported her missing. No evidence connected him to the crime. Friends and classmates. Theresa's social circle was interviewed extensively. No one reported any conflicts, threats, or concerning behavior from anyone in Theresa's life. Co-workers. Everyone who worked at Hot Skates was questioned. The manager who fired Theresa, the other snack bar workers, the DJ, the security staff. All provided alibis or were cleared through investigation. Known sex offenders. Police checked registries of convicted sex offenders in Nassau County. Several were questioned and eliminated. Witnesses along her route. Multiple people had seen Theresa walking home crying, but no one reported seeing anyone following her or approaching her. The investigation stalled. Whoever killed Theresa had either been a stranger who grabbed her opportunistically, or someone who knew her routine but hadn't raised red flags. 2 years after Theresa's murder, Nassau County prosecutors believed they'd solved the case. 3 men were arrested and charged with her rape and murder. John Kogut, 26 years old at time of arrest. Dennis Halstead, 23 years old. John Restivo, 20 years old. The 3 were local to the Lynbrook area. They'd been teenagers in 1984, and according to prosecutors, they had committed the murder together. The evidence against them was circumstantial. Confessions. Police claimed the 3 had confessed to the crime during interrogation. But there were problems with these confessions. They were coerced after hours of questioning. Details didn't match the crime scene. Each man later recanted, claiming they'd been pressured to confess. No physical evidence corroborated the confessions. Witness testimony. A jailhouse informant claimed one of the men had admitted to the murder while incarcerated. Jailhouse informants are notoriously unreliable. They often lie in exchange for reduced sentences or other benefits. No DNA evidence. In 1986, DNA analysis was just beginning to be used in criminal cases. The biological evidence from Theresa's body was tested for blood type, but this could only narrow possibilities, not identify specific individuals. The blood type was consistent with the 3 defendants, but also consistent with millions of other men. Despite the weak evidence, all 3 men were convicted in 1986 and sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. John Kogut, Dennis Halstead, and John Restivo, maintaining their innocence, began serving life sentences for a murder they didn't commit. Why? For 17 years, John Kogut, Dennis Halstead, and John Restivo sat in New York State prisons proclaiming their innocence. They appealed their convictions. They wrote letters to advocacy organizations. They begged for their cases to be reviewed. But the justice system is slow to acknowledge mistakes. Overturning a conviction requires new evidence. And until DNA technology advanced enough to test the biological evidence from Theresa's case, these men had no way to prove their innocence. John Restivo would later describe those 17 years. Every day, someone would ask, "How are you doing today?" I'd say, "Not good. I woke up on the wrong side of the wall this morning." You don't just lose your freedom. You lose your family, your friends, your entire life. And you know you're innocent, but no one believes you. The 3 men became cellmates in some facilities, friends, bonded by shared injustice. They supported each other through the darkest times. They promised each other that somehow, someday, the truth would come out. That day came in 2003. I've realized, by the early 2000s, DNA analysis had become sophisticated enough to extract profiles from old biological evidence. The Innocence Project and similar organizations were successfully using DNA to exonerate wrongly convicted individuals across the country. In 2002, attorneys for John Kogut, Dennis Halstead, and John Restivo petitioned for DNA testing of the evidence from Theresa Fusco's case. Nassau County District Attorney's Office initially opposed the request. Prosecutors rarely want to acknowledge wrongful convictions. But eventually, under pressure from advocacy groups and media coverage, the DA's office agreed to testing. The vaginal swabs collected from Theresa's body in 1984 were sent to a laboratory for DNA analysis. Scientists extracted genetic material, amplified it using PCR, polymerase chain reaction, and developed a complete DNA profile of Theresa's killer. Then, that profile was compared to DNA samples from John Kogut, Dennis Halstead, and John Restivo. No match. Not even close. The DNA from Theresa's body belonged to one man, an unknown individual whose genetic profile didn't match any of the 3 convicted men. The statistical probability was overwhelming. The 3 men in prison were innocent. The real killer was someone else. Once leader. On February 21, 2003, a judge overturned the convictions of all 3 men. After 17 years in prison, John Kogut, Dennis Halstead, and John Restivo were released. John Restivo spoke to Good Morning America hours after his release. "Yesterday I was able to say I woke up on the right side of the wall this morning. After 17 years of waking up in prison for a crime I didn't commit, I'm finally free. But I'm angry too. 17 years of my life were stolen. The real killer has been free this whole time, and Theresa's family still doesn't have justice." The exoneration sparked outrage. How had Nassau County prosecutors convicted 3 innocent men? How had confessions been coerced? Why had the jailhouse informant been believed? The case became a symbol of everything wrong with the American justice system. Rushed prosecutions, coerced confessions, reliance on unreliable witnesses, and failure to follow evidence. But there was a silver lining. The DNA profile of the real killer was now in the system. It was entered into SODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, the national database. If the killer was ever arrested for another crime and his DNA collected, CODIS would alert investigators to the match. Everyone assumed it was only a matter of time before the real killer was identified. You'll know then, Theresa Fusco's murder went back to cold case status. The DNA profile from 1984 was in CODIS, but no matches came back. This meant one of 2 things. 1. The killer had never been arrested for another crime. 2. The killer had committed Theresa's murder before DNA collection became standard practice in arrests. Nassau County detectives reviewed the case periodically. They checked CODIS regularly for any hits. They re-interviewed witnesses. They followed up on tips that came in whenever local media covered the anniversary of Theresa's death. But leads dried up. The case remained unsolved. Thomas Fusco aged, his daughter's photograph yellowing in his wallet. The 3 exonerated men tried to rebuild their lives after losing 17 years. And somewhere, Theresa's killer walked free, confident that he'd gotten away with murder. A long shot, Theresa's case was part of a larger mystery. In the months surrounding her disappearance and death, 2 other teenage girls in the Lynbrook area also went missing. The community had nicknamed the area the Lynbrook Triangle, a grim reference to the Bermuda Triangle, where ships and planes mysteriously vanished. Were these disappearances connected? Did Theresa's killer strike multiple times? Investigators examined possible links but found no definitive connections. The other missing girls' cases remained unsolved as well. The fear that had gripped Lynbrook in 1984 to 1985 never fully went away. Parents who'd been teenagers then now had teenage daughters of their own, and they remembered. They warned their children. They didn't let them walk alone at night. The shadow of Theresa Fusco's murder stretched across 4 decades. Meanwhile, forensic science continued advancing. In 2018, investigators caught the Golden State Killer, Joseph James DeAngelo, using a revolutionary technique called forensic genetic genealogy. They'd uploaded his DNA profile to GEDmatch, a public genealogy database, identified distant relatives, built family trees, and ultimately identified DeAngelo. This technique transformed cold case investigations. Suddenly, cases that seemed unsolvable had a path to resolution. Police departments across America began sending old DNA evidence to specialized labs for genealogy analysis. In 2023, Nassau County decided to try this technique on Theresa's case. In August 2023, investigators sent the vaginal swab from Theresa's case to Othram Inc., a laboratory in Houston, Texas, specializing in forensic genetic genealogy. Othram's CEO, David Middleman, and his team had solved dozens of cold cases using this technique. The process was complex. Step 1. Extract and sequence DNA. Othram scientists carefully extracted whatever genetic material remained on the 39-year-old swab. Using advanced sequencing technology, they built a complete DNA profile. Step 2. Upload to genealogy databases. The profile was uploaded to public genealogy databases where millions of people had voluntarily submitted their DNA to learn about their ancestry. The system searched for genetic relatives, not exact matches, but distant cousins who shared DNA segments with Theresa's killer. Step 3. Build family trees. When distant relatives were identified, genealogists began building family trees. They traced these relatives back through generations to find common ancestors, then worked forward through time, documenting all descendants of those ancestors. Step 4. Narrow suspect pool. Using birth records, census data, obituaries, marriage licenses, and other public records, genealogists narrowed the pool of possible suspects based on age, location, and other factors. The killer had to be male, had to be in his late teens or older in 1984, had to have connections to the Lynbrook area. By early 2024, the genealogy work had identified a specific family line, and one name stood out: Richard Bilodeau. Richard Bilodeau was 23 years old in November 1984 when Theresa Fusco was murdered. He lived with his grandparents at 16 Treadwell Avenue in Lynbrook, exactly 1 mile from Halstead's roller rink and from the Fusco family home. This proximity was crucial. Bilodeau knew the neighborhood. He knew the shortcuts through the wooded areas. He knew where teenagers walked late at night. And on November 10, 1984, he encountered Theresa Fusco walking home crying after being fired. What happened next, whether he followed her, grabbed her, lured her somehow, may never be fully known. But at some point between 10 p.m. and midnight, Richard Bilodeau raped and strangled Theresa Fusco, then hid her body under leaves and shipping pallets in a wooded area. After the murder, Bilodeau left Lynbrook. He eventually settled in Center Moriches, a town about 40 miles east on Long Island. He got a job at Walmart in Suffolk County, where he worked for years. He lived a quiet, unremarkable life. Neighbors who would later be interviewed by media described him as a loner but not obviously dangerous. "Weird," one neighbor said, "but we had no idea he was a murderer." For 41 years, Richard Bilodeau thought he'd gotten away with it. 3 other men had been convicted and imprisoned for his crime. When they were exonerated in 2003 based on DNA evidence, Bilodeau must have felt a moment of fear. His DNA was now in the system. But when no arrest came, when years passed without police knocking on his door, he probably convinced himself he was safe. He was wrong. But when genealogy analysis identified Richard Bilodeau as a suspect, investigators couldn't immediately arrest him. They needed direct DNA confirmation, proof that Bilodeau's DNA matched the DNA from Theresa's body. They could have gotten a court order to compel a DNA sample, but that would have alerted Bilodeau that he was a suspect. If he fled or destroyed evidence, the case could be compromised. Investigators decided on a different approach: obtain his DNA surreptitiously. In early 2024, Nassau County detectives began surveilling Bilodeau. They watched his movements, documented his routines, waited for an opportunity to collect discarded DNA. This is legal. Once someone throws away an item in public, they have no expectation of privacy regarding that item. Courts have repeatedly upheld the practice of collecting discarded DNA to identify suspects in serious crimes. For weeks, surveillance teams followed Bilodeau. They watched him go to work at Walmart. They watched him run errands, buy groceries, live his mundane life. They waited for the right moment. That moment came in February 2024 at a smoothie cafe. Hola, Monsieur Ember. It was an ordinary Tuesday in February 2024. Richard Bilodeau, 63 years old now, walked into a tropical smoothie cafe in Suffolk County, Long Island. He ordered a smoothie. The exact flavor has never been publicly disclosed, though investigators know. He paid. He sat at a table. He drank his smoothie through a plastic straw. What Bilodeau didn't know: 2 Nassau County detectives were watching him from an unmarked vehicle in the parking lot. What he definitely didn't know: this smoothie straw would end his 41 years of freedom. Bilodeau finished his drink, threw the cup and straw in the trash, and left the cafe. He got in his vehicle and drove away, heading home to Center Morich's. Just another Tuesday. Just another smoothie. Nothing unusual. The moment his vehicle disappeared from view, the detectives moved quickly. They entered the cafe. They approached the trash can. Using gloves and evidence collection bags, they carefully retrieved the cup Bilodeau had discarded. The straw inside that cup contained something invaluable: Bilodeau's saliva. And saliva contains DNA. We know Zealänder. The cup and straw were immediately transported to the Nassau County Police Forensic Laboratory. Standard chain of custody protocols were followed. Every person who touched the evidence signed documents. Every transfer was recorded with dates and times. Every step was photographed and documented. In the laboratory, forensic scientists carefully removed the straw from the cup. Using sterile swabs, they collected saliva residue from the straw's surface, the areas where Bilodeau's mouth had touched it. This biological material was then processed for DNA extraction. The process is complex, but essentially involves: 1. Breaking open the cells in the saliva to release DNA. 2. Purifying the DNA, removing proteins and other cellular material. 3. Amplifying the DNA using PCR, polymerase chain reaction, to create millions of copies. 4. Analyzing specific genetic markers to create a DNA profile. The resulting profile, a unique genetic fingerprint belonging to Richard Bilodeau, was then compared to the DNA profile from the vaginal swab taken from Theresa Fusco's body in 1984. The comparison took several days. Multiple analysts reviewed the results independently to ensure accuracy. This was a 41-year-old murder case with 3 previous wrongful convictions. There could be no mistakes. On March 8, 2024, the final report was complete. DNA match, 100% certainty. Statistical probability, 1 in multiple trillion. Richard Bilodeau was definitively, scientifically, beyond any reasonable doubt, the man who raped and murdered Theresa Fusco on November 10, 1984. Who was younger? With DNA confirmation in hand, prosecutors began building their case. District Attorney Ann T. Donnelly and her cold case unit reviewed every aspect of the investigation. The 1984 evidence: original crime scene photographs, medical examiner's report, autopsy findings, witness statements from people who saw Theresa walking home, timeline of her last known movements, the 1986 to 2003 wrongful convictions, documentation showing how John Kogut, Dennis Halstead, and John Restivo were wrongly convicted, the 2003 DNA exoneration, evidence that the original prosecution was flawed, the 2023 to 2024 breakthrough, forensic genetic genealogy reports showing how Bilodeau was identified through distant relatives, surveillance logs documenting Bilodeau's movements, chain of custody documentation for the smoothie straw, laboratory reports confirming DNA match. Richard Bilodeau's background: residence history showing he lived 1 mile from crime scene in 1984, employment records, criminal history if any, current residence and employment. The case was airtight. Prosecutors knew they had enough evidence for conviction, but they wanted to be thorough. This arrest had to be perfect. Theresa's family had waited 41 years. The 3 exonerated men deserved justice. There could be no procedural mistakes that might allow Bilodeau to escape on a technicality. By October 2024, Everything was ready. The grand jury was convened. Evidence was presented. On October 14, 2025, the grand jury returned an indictment. Richard Bilodeau was indicted for murder in the second degree, intentional murder, murder in the second degree, murder during commission of rape. Both charges carried sentences of 25 years to life in prison. The arrest warrant was signed. Execution was scheduled for October 14, 2025, the same day as the indictment.
Yvnona's Yunander.
The sun hadn't risen yet when Nassau County detectives, supported by Suffolk County Police tactical units, surrounded Richard Bilodeau's home in Center Moriches. It was a modest single-story house on a quiet suburban street. Neighbors were still asleep. The world was dark and quiet. Lead Detective Thomas Calabrese radioed to his team. "All units, this is Calabrese. We are go for arrest. Execute on my mark. 3, 2, 1. Execute." Officers approached the front door. A battering ram was held ready in case entry was refused. Detective Calabrese knocked loudly, the official police knock that everyone recognizes, even from sleep. "Nassau County Police! Search warrant! Open the door!" Lights flickered on inside. Footsteps. The door opened a crack, chain still attached. Richard Bilodeau peered out, squinting in the glare of police flashlights. He looked confused, genuinely confused. Maybe he'd thought after 41 years he was safe. Maybe he'd convinced himself the smoothie straw had been random trash collection. "Richard Bilodeau?" Detective Calabrese asked, though he knew exactly who he was looking at. "Yes?" Bilodeau's voice was uncertain, scratchy from sleep. "I have a warrant for your arrest. Open the door and come out with your hands visible." For a moment, Bilodeau stood frozen. Then resignation seemed to wash over him. His shoulders slumped. He closed the door, removed the chain, and opened it fully. "Put your hands behind your back." Bilodeau complied without resistance. The handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists. 63 years old, gray hair, wearing pajama pants and a t-shirt. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like someone's grandfather. But monsters rarely look like what we expect. "Richard Bilodeau, you are under arrest for the murder of Theresa Fusco. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you. Do you understand these rights as I have explained them?" "Yes." Bilodeau's only word. He was placed in the back of a police cruiser. Officers entered his home with a search warrant, looking for any evidence that might connect him to Theresa's murder. Journals, photographs, news clippings, anything. The search would take hours, but Bilodeau wasn't there to see it. He was being transported to Nassau County Police Headquarters for booking. Never was note of it. Wangrim Yvnadland Olmde Sedbus. At Nassau County Police Headquarters, Richard Bilodeau went through standard booking procedures. 7:15 a.m. Fingerprinting. Digital fingerprint scanner captured prints from all 10 fingers. These were uploaded to state and federal databases to check for any outstanding warrants or previous arrests under different names. 7:30 a.m. Photographing mugshot. Front view, left profile, right profile. The photos would be released to media within hours and would be seen by millions. Bilodeau's face, gray hair, glasses, blank expression, would become the face of evil in Long Island's consciousness. 7:45 a.m. Medical screening. Standard health check. Blood pressure elevated. Stress from arrest. No immediate medical concerns. No medications required. 8 a.m. Property inventory. Bilodeau's personal items logged. Wallet with $34 cash. Driver's license. Bank card. House keys. Wedding ring. everything placed in a labeled bag, stored in evidence. 8:15 a.m. Cell assignment. Bilodeau placed in holding cell pending arraignment. Standard isolation protocol for high-profile arrests, both for his protection and to prevent him from communicating with anyone before court appearance. Throughout the entire booking process, Bilodeau said nothing beyond yes-no responses to direct questions. He didn't ask what evidence police had, didn't proclaim innocence, didn't request a lawyer. Just silent compliance. Experienced detectives recognized this behavior. The resignation of someone who knows they've been caught, who knows the evidence is overwhelming, who knows that 41 years of freedom are over. The courtroom was packed. Media filled the press section. Every major news outlet in the New York area sent reporters. Local TV stations set up cameras. National news networks dispatched correspondents. This was the story everyone had been waiting for. The Long Island roller rink murder solved after 41 years. In the gallery, Theresa Fusco sat in the front row, flanked by family members. He was in his 70s now, hair white, face lined with decades of grief. He clutched a framed photograph of Theresa, the same high school photo from 1984, the one that had been on missing person flyers. The one that appeared in every news article about the case. Behind him sat the three exonerated men, John Kogut, Dennis Halstead, and John Restivo. Now in their 60s, these men had served 17 years in prison for a crime they didn't commit. They had every right to be bitter, angry, broken. But today their faces showed something else. Vindication. The real killer was finally being held accountable. At 9:15 a.m., Richard Bilodeau was led into the courtroom. He wore an orange Nassau County Jail jumpsuit, hands shackled in front of him, ankles chained. Two deputies flanked him. He shuffled to the defense table, where his court-appointed attorney Michael Reynolds waited. Judge Helene Gugerty entered. Everyone stood. She! Case number 2025 CR 9846. The people of the state of New York versus Richard Bilodeau. Mr. Bilodeau, you are charged with murder in the second degree, intentional murder, and murder in the second degree during the commission of rape. How do you plead? Bilodeau's attorney leaned close, whispered in his ear. Bilodeau nodded. Not guilty, Your Honor. That will not. District Attorney Ann T. Donnelly rose to address the court. Her voice was clear, firm, carrying the weight of 41 years of injustice. For 41 years, Theresa's family has waited for justice. For 17 of those years, 3 innocent men, John Kogut, Dennis Halstead, and John Restivo, sat in prison for a crime they didn't commit. Those men are here today, Your Honor. They are here to see the real killer finally held accountable. In 1984, the defendant left his DNA on Theresa's body. That DNA was carefully preserved by investigators who hoped that someday science would advance enough to identify the killer. In 2024, forensic genetic genealogy identified the defendant through distant relatives. Investigators then obtained his DNA from a discarded smoothie straw. The DNA from that straw is a 100% match, not 90%, not 95%, but 100%, to the DNA recovered from Theresa Fusco's body in 1984. The statistical probability that this DNA belongs to anyone other than the defendant is 1 in multiple trillion. Science doesn't lie, Your Honor. After 41 years and 3 wrongful convictions, we finally have Theresa's killer. The people request remand pending trial. All of the end of it. Michael Reynolds, Bilodeau's attorney, stood next. He looked uncomfortable. Defending an accused child killer is never easy, especially when the DNA evidence is this strong. Your Honor, my client pleads not guilty to these charges. While the DNA evidence is concerning, There are questions about chain of custody over 41 years, questions about how the evidence was stored, and questions about contamination possibilities. We request reasonable bail and ask that my client be allowed to remain free pending trial. Judge Kogut didn't hesitate. Gavel down. Richard Bilodeau was led out of the courtroom. He never looked at Thomas Fusco, never acknowledged Theresa's family, never showed remorse. As he disappeared through the courtroom doors, Thomas Fusco whispered to himself, "We got him, Theresa. We finally got him." The time. Outside the courthouse, surrounded by media microphones and cameras, Thomas Fusco read a prepared statement. His hands trembled as he held the paper, but his voice was strong. "For 41 years, I have lived with a hole in my heart where my daughter should be. Theresa was 16 years old. She had dreams, plans, a future. That was stolen from her by Richard Bilodeau. He took her life, and then he took 41 more years from my family by hiding what he'd done." 3 innocent men, John, Dennis, and John, spent 17 years in prison for a crime they didn't commit. Their lives were stolen too. I am grateful that modern DNA technology has finally revealed the truth and brought the real killer to justice. I want to thank the Nassau County Police, District Attorney Ann Donnelly, the cold case detectives who never gave up, Othram Inc., and the forensic genealogists who identified Bilodeau, and everyone who has worked on this case over 4 decades. Because of your dedication, Theresa can finally rest in peace. To Richard Bilodeau, I have one thing to say. You thought you got away with it. For 41 years you lived your life freely while my daughter lay in a grave. But DNA doesn't forget. Justice took 41 years, but it arrived. You will spend the rest of your life in prison for what you did. And when you die, you will face a higher judgment for the life you stole. Thomas folded the paper, tears streaming down his face. He was led away by family members, finally able to grieve, knowing that justice had been served. K. John Restivo, now 59 years old, approached the microphones next. Behind him stood John Kogut, 69, and Dennis Halstead, 62, the 3 men who had been wrongly convicted in 1986 and exonerated in 2003. "My name is John Restivo," he began, voice steady despite obvious emotion. "In 1986, I was 20 years old when I was arrested and charged with murdering Theresa Fusco. I didn't do it. John Kogut didn't do it. Dennis Halstead didn't do it. But we were convicted anyway based on coerced confessions and jailhouse informant testimony. We spent 17 years in prison. 17 years away from our families, our lives, our freedom. Every single day we told anyone who would listen, we are innocent, but no one believed us. Until 2003, when DNA testing proved what we'd been saying all along. Today, 22 years after our exoneration, the real killer has finally been arrested. Richard Bilodeau lived free while we sat in prison cells for his crime. He walked around Long Island, went to work, lived his life, while we were locked away for something we didn't do. I'm not going to say there's justice in this. You can't give us back 17 years. You can't erase what we went through. But at least Theresa's family finally has answers. At least the real killer will face consequences. And at least everyone knows, finally, definitively, beyond any doubt, that we were innocent. This case shows everything wrong with our justice system. Coerced confessions, jailhouse informants, prosecutors more concerned with convictions than truth. If DNA technology hadn't advanced, we'd still be in prison. Or worse, we'd have been executed if New York had the death penalty in 1986. So I say this. Reform the system. Record all interrogations. Ban jailhouse informant testimony. Make DNA testing automatic in all serious cases. And listen when someone says, "I didn't do it." Because sometimes, like in our case, they're telling the truth. John Kogut and Dennis Halstead nodded in agreement, too emotional to speak themselves. Later that afternoon, DA Ann Donnelly held an official press conference at Nassau County Government Center. She stood before a podium displaying photos of Theresa Fusco, crime scene evidence markers, and a timeline of the 41-year investigation. Today marks the end of one of Nassau County's longest-running cold cases, Donnelly began. Richard Bilodeau has been arrested and charged with the 1984 murder of Theresa Fusco. The DNA evidence against him is overwhelming and irrefutable. I want to acknowledge the mistakes made in this case. In 1986, 3 innocent men were wrongly convicted of this murder. That conviction was based on flawed evidence, coerced confessions, and unreliable witness testimony. Those men served 17 years before DNA exonerated them in 2003. To John Kogut, Dennis Halstead, and John Restivo, on behalf of the Nassau County District Attorney's Office, I apologize for what you endured. You deserved better from our justice system. But I also want to highlight what went right in this case. In 1984, investigators carefully preserved biological evidence, even though DNA analysis didn't exist yet. That preservation proved crucial 40 years later. In 2023, our cold case unit partnered with Othram Inc. to use forensic genetic genealogy, the same technique that caught the Golden State Killer. That partnership identified Richard Bilodeau through distant relatives. In February 2024, our detectives obtained Bilodeau's DNA from a discarded smoothie straw. Laboratory analysis confirmed a 100% match to the DNA from Theresa's body. The statistical probability is 1 in multiple trillion. There is no doubt. Richard Bilodeau raped and murdered Theresa Fusco. This case demonstrates several important truths. First, evidence preservation matters. What couldn't be analyzed in 1984 solved the case in 2024. Second, forensic genetic genealogy works. This technique has solved hundreds of cold cases nationwide. Third, justice has no expiration date. 41 years passed between the crime and the arrest, but we never stopped investigating. Fourth, we must learn from wrongful convictions. The 1986 conviction of 3 innocent men shows the dangers of coerced confessions and unreliable testimony. We have reformed our procedures to prevent similar mistakes. Finally, DNA doesn't lie. Richard Bilodeau thought he'd gotten away with murder. He was wrong. Donnelly concluded with a promise. To every family with an unsolved murder in Nassau County, I say this: we will never stop investigating. We will never give up on your loved ones. And as science advances, cases that seem unsolvable today may be solved tomorrow. We owe that persistence to victims like Theresa Fusco and families like the Fuscos, who have waited decades for answers. As of October 22, 2025, today, Richard Bilodeau remains in Nassau County Jail awaiting trial. He is 63 years old. He is housed in isolation for his protection. Child killers are not well received by other inmates. He has declined all media interview requests. His attorney has advised him to remain silent. Trial date, April 2026. Charges: murder in the second degree, 2 counts. Potential sentence: 25 years to life on each count. Sentences could run consecutively, back to back, meaning Bilodeau could face 50 years to life. Likelihood of conviction: extremely high given DNA evidence. With a death knife, the prosecution's case will be straightforward. DNA evidence, the centerpiece. DNA from the 1984 crime scene matches Bilodeau's DNA from the 2024 smoothie straw with 1 in multiple trillion certainty. Forensic genetic genealogy. Experts will explain how Bilodeau was identified through family trees built from distant relatives. Timeline evidence. Witness statements from 1984 placing Theresa walking home around 10 p.m. Bilodeau lived 1 mile from the crime scene and had opportunity. Medical examiner testimony. The 1984 autopsy report showing cause of death, strangulation, sexual assault, and time of death. Chain of custody. Documentation showing the biological evidence was properly preserved and handled from 1984 to 2024. The defense will likely argue. Chain of custody concerns over 41 years. Contamination possibilities. Questions about genealogy methodology. But these arguments are weak against DNA evidence this strong. Legal experts following the case predict a guilty verdict is almost certain. So here, said John Kogut, 69 years old, lives in Long Island, works as an advocate for wrongful conviction reform, has spoken at multiple legal conferences about his experience, receives no compensation for his 17 years of wrongful imprisonment beyond a small state compensation payment. Dennis Halstead, 62 years old, lives in New York, has largely stayed out of the public eye but agreed to speak at Bilodeau's arraignment. Struggles with PTSD from his prison experience. John Restivo, 59 years old, most vocal of the three, works with the Innocence Project and similar organizations, has been interviewed on Good Morning America, 48 Hours, and Dateline about his experience. Married with children, rebuilding a life stolen from him. All three have filed civil lawsuits against Nassau County for wrongful conviction. Those cases are ongoing. The one is Yugmer. Theresa's father is in his mid-70s now. He has spent 41 years waiting for this moment. He attends every court hearing related to Bilodeau's case. He keeps Theresa's photograph in his wallet and visits her grave regularly. In a recent interview, he said, "For 41 years, I wondered if I'd die before Theresa's killer was caught. But I didn't. I lived to see justice. That's all I ever wanted, to know who took my daughter and see them held accountable. DNA technology gave me that. I'm grateful." Theresa Fusco's case has become a landmark example of multiple important criminal justice issues. Forensic genetic genealogy. This case proves the technique works even in decades-old cases with degraded evidence. Hundreds of other cold cases are now being investigated using this method. Evidence preservation. The 1984 investigators who carefully preserved biological evidence are credited with solving the case 40 years later. Their meticulous work is now taught in forensic science programs as a best practice example. Wrongful conviction reform. The 17-year imprisonment of 3 innocent men sparked reforms in interrogation practices, confession documentation, and jailhouse informant testimony. New York State now requires all interrogations to be video recorded. Jailhouse informant testimony faces higher scrutiny. Cold case persistence. This case demonstrates that cold doesn't mean closed. Nassau County's cold case unit has solved 7 additional murders from the 1980s to 1990s using similar DNA techniques. Public DNA databases. The case raises ongoing debates about privacy versus justice. Bilodeau was identified through distant relatives who voluntarily submitted DNA to genealogy websites. Should police be allowed to use these databases? The debate continues, but cases like Theresa's show the life-saving and justice-delivering potential. Another was Yunver. 3 innocent men, John Kogut, Dennis Halstead, and John Restivo, were wrongly convicted and spent 17 years in prison for Bilodeau's crime. They maintained their innocence throughout. DNA finally exonerated them in 2003. But the real killer remained free until October 14, 2025, when a discarded smoothie straw and advanced DNA technology finally caught him. This case proves fundamental truths. DNA doesn't lie. Even 41-year-old evidence can solve cases. Evidence preservation matters. What couldn't be analyzed in 1984 solved the case in 2024. Forensic genetic genealogy works. Distant relatives led to the killer. Justice has no expiration date. 41 years between crime and arrest. Wrongful convictions happen. 3 innocent men lost 17 years. Science catches killers. Technology advances. Killers can't hide forever. If you've watched to the end, thank you for honoring Theresa Fusco's memory. She was more than a murder victim. She was a daughter, a teenager with dreams, someone's little girl who deserved a long life. Subscribe for more cold case documentaries. Like, if you believe DNA technology is revolutionizing justice. Share, to honor Theresa's memory and show that justice never expires. Theresa Fusco, November 10, 1968. November 10, 1984. Age 16. Forever remembered. Richard Bilodeau, age 23 at murder, 1984. Age 63 at arrest, 2025. Status: awaiting trial. Likely sentence: 25 years to life or 50 years to life. The 3 exonerated men: wrongly convicted, 1986. Exonerated, 2003. Lost 17 years to wrongful imprisonment. Finally vindicated, October 2025. After 41 years, justice delayed, but finally delivered. A smoothie straw caught a killer. DNA freed 3 innocent men. And Theresa Fusco can finally rest in peace.